Welcome back, everybody. Ready to dive into some more fascinating history.
Always.
Today, we're looking at the history of disaster.
Oh, yeah. A great topic.
We've got The Dawn of Disasters by Conrad Riker.
Great book.
Plus a ton of other research and articles we found, to get a really good, well-rounded view of this whole thing.
Yeah, and when you look at disasters throughout history, it's interesting because you start to see the patterns, the connections, and how these things ripple through time, They have effects for generations sometimes.
Okay, so where do we even start? I mean, history of disaster, this is a pretty broad subject.
Well, I think we should start with ancient warfare.
Okay, so ancient warfare. Now, that might seem like a strange place to start when we're talking about disasters.
Well, think about it. You've got armies on the move, and they could completely decimate the local resources. And you end up with famine. Battles often destroy crops and infrastructure. And of course, that makes things ripe for disease outbreak. Then you've got sieges. Sieges could cut off entire cities from food and water.
Oh, yeah. Mass starvation.
Exactly. So you see, warfare itself can cause these cascading...
Yeah, it's like a catalyst for all these other terrible things to happen.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got the natural disasters that happen at the same time.
Right.
Like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius back in 79 AD.
Oh, yeah, that one's crazy. I mean, Pompeii and Herculaneum.
Exactly.
Buried completely. Just gone.
It's a reminder of how quickly and completely a natural disaster can just wipe out a civilization.
It's like a snapshot in time, isn't it?
It is. It's like a time capsule.
Pompeii frozen in ash.
And it gives us clues, about the society back then, how they lived their social structure, even their art. And that tells us about their strengths, their vulnerability.
So are you saying by studying ancient disasters, we're not just learning about what happened, but also about how those societies actually worked? And maybe why they collapsed.
Precisely. And sometimes these insights can be really relevant even to us today.
Okay, so give me an example. I mean, how can ancient Rome, buried under volcanic ash, tell us anything about the modern world?
Well, let's take the Justinianic plague.
Okay.
This was a pandemic, swept through the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century AD, killed millions of people, really weakened the empire, and it's considered one of the factors that led to its decline.
It's kind of eerie, actually.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar, especially after what we all went through with COVID-19.
Exactly. And while pandemics are all different, the specifics, there's some striking parallels in how societies respond. You see the same social and economic disruptions, and then long-term consequences are pretty similar too.
So it's like history is giving us a warning, saying even the most powerful civilizations, they can be brought down by something as small as a virus.
It is a warning. And it highlights how important it is that we learn from the past and try to understand those patterns. Because while these events are devastating, they can also be opportunities to learn and grow and change.
So we've talked about ancient warfare and these pandemics. What other kinds of disasters were happening way back then?
Well, let's move on to the Age of Exploration.
Okay, the Age of Exploration.
This was a period of incredible discovery, expansion.
Right.
But there were also a lot of unintended consequences. And a lot of disasters happened during this period.
I can imagine. I mean, they were sailing off into the unknown.
Right. And one fascinating example that's often overlooked is the introduction of rats to new environments.
Really? Rats. I mean, it seems kind of minor compared to, shipwrecks and scurvy and things like that.
Well, it's not about the rats themselves. It's the ripple effects they caused.
Okay.
Because they would get on these ships in Europe, sail across the ocean, and they'd end up in these new ecosystems where they had no natural predator.
Oh, so they just multiplied like crazy.
Exactly. They outcompeted native species, disrupted food chains, spread disease.
Wow. So a little rat could actually trigger all these ecological disasters.
Exactly. And it highlights this recurring theme in the history of disaster. Unintended consequences.
Yeah, we just don't know what we don't know, do we?
Right. And the Age of Exploration is full of examples like this. For example, the pursuit of gold and ivory led to deforestation, habitat loss, and the exploitation of indigenous populations.
So like exploration itself, this human drive to discover and expand, it had this dark side, this potential for destruction and exploitation.
Exactly. And it's a theme that continues today, as we deal with climate change, resource depletion, and ethical questions about all this new technology we're developing.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient warfare to the Age of Exploration. And I'm starting to see some connections here, some recurring patterns in how these disasters happened and the impact they had on societies. Let's keep going. What's next on our timeline?
Well, let's jump ahead to the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, the Industrial Revolution.
Another period of incredible innovation, technological advancements, but like we've seen again and again. Unintended consequences, more disaster.
Well, I imagine. Factories and pollution Probably some pretty bad industrial accidents back then.
Yeah, you're right. The Industrial Revolution created progress and productivity, but it also created all these new risks and vulnerabilities.
Give me an example. What kind of disasters are we talking about here?
Well, one example is a silver mill explosion in Virginia in 1914.
Okay.
A dust explosion at the Alice mine killed 152 men.
Wow, 152. It's hard to even fathom that kind of loss.
It is, and it highlights the danger of inadequate safety regulations in a rapidly industrializing world.
It's like progress comes at a cost sometimes, and human life is part of that cost.
Yeah, and as technology advanced, the potential for even larger scale disasters just kept growing.
Right.
And we saw that with Chernobyl in 1986.
Oh, yeah?
Design flaws, human error, lack of transparency, and it led to a catastrophic explosion and fire. Released all this radioactive material into the environment.
And it's still affecting people today.
Yeah. Chernobyl really highlights the risks that come with these powerful technology. They can be amazing, but if they're not managed carefully, it can be devastating.
It seems like every time humans gain more power, whether it's through technology or empires or, just extracting resources, we create more opportunities for disaster.
That's a great observation. And it leads us to our next topic, the Anthropocene.
Okay, the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of scary. What is that exactly?
It's a proposed geological epoch. It recognizes the huge impact of human activity on the planet.
You mean like climate change and pollution and all that?
Exactly. Deforestation, everything. We're altering the planet on a global scale.
So we're not just talking about isolated disasters anymore. We're talking about a whole new era defined by human-caused environmental damage.
Yeah, that's the reality we're facing. And it has huge implications for our future.
It's a lot to think about. I mean, the fate of the planet is kind of riding on this.
It is a big challenge, but before we can even start thinking about solutions, we need to understand the historical context. And that's why we're looking at all this,
Right.
learning from the past, seeing the patterns to help us navigate the future.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient volcanoes to nuclear disasters. And now we're facing the Anthropocene. It's a lot to take in, but I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
And that's what this is all about. It's about understanding how disasters have shaped our world and how they're all connected in these complex ways.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. I'm ready to keep going. What's next on the agenda?
We've seen how destructive these disasters can be, but we've also seen how resilient humans can be. So in part 2, we're going to look at some incredible stories of survival, adaptation, and even innovation in the face of some of these terrible events.
Okay. I'm ready for a little bit of hope after all that doom and gloom. Can't wait to dive back in. Welcome back, everyone. I don't know about you, but part 1 of our deep dive got me thinking. I mean, we journeyed all the way from ancient calamities to the dawn of the Anthropocene.
Right.
And uncovering these patterns, these connections. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
It is fascinating, isn't it? These events, they can be tragic, but they also reveal so much about human nature.
Our ability to destroy things and also to rebuild. Our resilience.
Exactly.
And speaking of resilience, you mentioned, we'd be looking at some inspiring stories of survival and adaptation.
We are.
And I'm ready for some good news after all that doom and gloom.
Well, how about we start with a story that I think really captivated the world back in 2010.
Okay.
The 33 Chilean miners, remember them, trapped underground for 69 days.
Oh, yeah. How could I forget that? The whole world was watching, wasn't waiting to see if they would get those guys out.
Yeah.
It really did feel like a miracle when they finally got them all to the surface.
It really was a miracle, and it was a testament to human endurance and ingenuity, and really the power of people working together.
I mean, think about it. They're stuck down there. No idea if they're ever going to get out. It's incredible that they were able to establish a system of cooperation and communication,
Yeah.
and they really supported each other emotionally.
Yeah, they really did. They had strong leadership down there, clear communication, a real sense of purpose. And that was so important to their survival. It wasn't just about physical survival, it was about maintaining that mental and emotional well-being,
Right.
creating a sense of community in the midst of that unimaginable situation.
And it's a powerful message, isn't it?
It is. It's about hope, too. Believing that even in the darkest of times, rescue is possible. So you see, it's not just about being physically strong. It's about mental and emotional strength and fostering that sense of community, even when things are really bad.
Absolutely. So let's talk about another example of community resilience. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. A massive earthquake. Devastated coastal communities across so many different countries. Just unbelievable destruction and loss of life.
Yeah, it's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of that tragedy.
It's just images that are burned into my memory. Villages just completely wiped off the map, families torn apart.
It was a tragedy of epic proportions. But, even in the midst of all that heartbreak and loss, there was this extraordinary outpouring of compassion and generosity, a real spirit of community resilience. People from all over the world, they came together to help. They offered aid support expertise. They helped to rebuild homes infrastructure, and they helped to rebuild lives.
It also makes you think that in the face of suffering, humanity's best qualities come out. The empathy, the compassion, that desire to help people in need. It's a beautiful thing. And it really shows the importance of social connections and communities coming together to support each other, not just to respond to these disasters, but to rebuild afterward.
Yeah, that's so important. And we've seen that time and time again. Communities coming together to help each other after these terrible events. So we've seen the destructive power of disasters and the amazing resilience of humans. But what about technology? Can technology help us, to mitigate risks and build more resilient communities, respond more effectively to these disasters?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm thinking about how social media is used, during emergency. Sharing information, connecting people with resources, coordinating relief efforts. It's like a lifeline in times of crisis.
It really is. And social media has revolutionized disaster response. You get that rapid spread of information, community mobilization, even crowdfunding for relief efforts. It's a really powerful tool for connecting people with the resources they need.
So we've got social media, early warning system. What's on the horizon? What does the future of disaster management look like?
Well, one area that's really exciting is AI and machine learning. Yeah, and these technologies, they can transform how we predict, how we prepare for, and how we respond to disasters.
So you're talking like robots rescuing people from burning buildings.
Not quite robots, but AI systems. They can analyze tons of data, like weather patterns, sensor readings, even social media posts. And that helps us identify potential risks.
And you can predict where and when disasters might happen.
Exactly. So instead of reacting to disasters, we can try to anticipate them.
Potentially save lives and resources.
Yeah. And it goes beyond prediction. AI can also help us optimize evacuation routes, allocate resources, and even assist with search and rescue efforts.
Wow, that sounds amazing. AI is going to completely change the way we manage disasters. But like any powerful technology, I'm sure there are risks, and we have to consider the ethical implications.
You're absolutely right. We need to be careful as we embrace these technological advancements. We have to think about the ethical implications, make sure it's developed responsibly, and address any potential biases or vulnerabilities in the system.
So we need to make sure technology is helping us, not creating new problems.
Exactly. It should be a force multiplier for human resilience. And this brings us to a broader point that we've been talking about throughout this whole series, the interconnectedness of everything.
Okay, so explain that a little bit. What do you mean by everything being interconnected?
Well, think about it. We've seen that these disasters, whether they're natural or man-made, they're rarely isolated events.
Right.
They're usually the result of all these complex interactions, human actions, environmental factors, social structures, even technological systems.
So it's like a web. Like one event triggers a chain reaction.
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible to predict how things are going to play out.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important that we manage disasters holistically.
So consider all the factors.
Right.
Work together. Across disciplines, across sectors, even across national borders.
Yes, and it's about moving from a reactive mindset to a more proactive mindset. Anticipating disasters, understanding the underlying causes, and building systems that are more resilient. Systems that can withstand these shocks.
It's not just about surviving disaster. It's about learning from them, building back better, and making sure that we create a world that can withstand these kinds of events.
Well said. And it's also about recognizing that what we do has consequences, both individually and collectively. Our choices matter, whether it's how much we consume or the politicians we vote for, or how we invest in technology and innovation. All of that shapes the future. We're not just passive bystanders in this story. We have agency. We have a responsibility to make choices that contribute to a safer, more sustainable, and more resilient world.
It's a really powerful point.
Yeah.
So we're not just victims of circumstance. We have the power to influence what happens next. You mentioned something earlier that I wanted to come back to. The economic cost of disaster.
Yeah.
We often focus on, the human toll and the environmental damage, but disasters have a massive impact on economies as well.
They do. They can disrupt supply chains, damage infrastructure, displace workers, and lead to economic instability. And the cost of rebuilding after these major disasters, it can be astronomical. Governments, businesses, communities, they can be feeling the effects for years.
I mean, look at Hurricane Katrina, the devastation in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Both the human suffering and the economic losses.
The cost of rebuilding after Katrina was just enormous. And the city is still dealing with the economic and social consequences of that disaster.
So it's not just about the immediate crisis. It's about the long-term recovery and rebuilding in a way that makes us more resilient and helping communities to recover economically.
Exactly. And that requires a multi-pronged, government policies, insurance programs, private investment, community-led initiatives, all of that is important. So one of the keys is disaster risk reduction. investing in infrastructure that can withstand these extreme events,
Okay.
developing early warning systems, and implementing land use policies that help to minimize risk.
So it's like the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. By investing in preparedness and mitigation, we can significantly reduce the economic and social cost of these events.
What about insurance? What role does that play in all this?
Well, insurance can provide a safety net. For individuals, businesses, and governments, it helps them to offset those costs of rebuilding and recovery. And it can incentivize risk reduction. People who take steps to mitigate their risk, they often get lower premiums.
Right. But insurance can be expensive,
It can.
especially for people and businesses in high-risk areas. Is there anything we can do to make insurance more affordable and accessible for the people who really need it?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And that's something that policymakers and insurance companies are working on. One idea is to develop these public-private partnerships where you're sharing the risk-making coverage more affordable. Another approach is to incentivize those risk reduction measures by offering discounted premiums. So it's about finding creative solutions, balancing individual responsibility with collective action, and recognizing that economic resilience, it's not just about money, it's about people's lives, their ability to recover, and their sense of hope for the future.
Well said. And that brings us to another really important aspect of disaster management, the psychological impact.
Right.
These events, they can take a toll on our mental health, our well-being, both for individuals and for entire communities.
Yeah, and we saw that with the survivors of Hurricane Katrina. Many of them are still dealing with PTSD and the emotional scars from that experience.
It's hard to imagine going through something like that and coming out unscathed. The trauma, the loss, the displacement, the uncertainty, it all takes a toll.
It does, and it's important to recognize that mental health is just as important as physical health. We need to make sure that people have access to counseling, therapy, support groups, both in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, but also during that long-term recovery.
Right. But sometimes those resources are stretched thin,
They are.
especially in communities that are already struggling.
Yeah, and that's a challenge. But we need to make mental health a priority. We need to invest in these mental health services, train first responders to recognize those signs of trauma, and build community resilience through social support network. Create a culture where people feel comfortable asking for help and talking about what they've been through.
So it's not just about therapy, it's about creating a culture of support and understanding.
Exactly. And recognizing that healing takes time, takes patience, and it takes a collective effort. We need to support each other, listen with empathy, and foster a sense of hope and shared purpose as we rebuild.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about human resilience. We've talked about the role of technology and the economic and psychological impacts of disasters. I feel like I'm starting to really understand this complex issue.
I'm glad to hear that.
But I know we're not done yet. There's still more to explore, right?
There is. Our deep dive's not over yet. In part 3, we'll be looking at some of the most impactful disasters in recent history. Drawing out those lessons learned and exploring some potential solutions for building a more resilient future.
Okay. I'm ready to keep going. Welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive into the history of disasters. We've covered a lot of ground in parts 1 and 2, from those ancient plagues to modern-day technological mishaps. And what I've really been struck by, the lessons we've learned along the way.
Yeah, one of the biggest takeaways for me has been how these disasters, whether they're natural or man-made, they often reveal the vulnerabilities that we have in our systems and our societies and even in ourselves.
You're right. It's like we're peeling back the layers of history, and we're seeing how these events, while tragic of it, they can also be these catalysts for change, for innovation.
Yeah.
And they give us this deeper understanding of who we are and the world we live in.
Exactly. And today we're going to zero in on some specific disasters that happened in the 21st century, events that captured the world's attention, that really made us think and confront some uncomfortable truths about the world today.
Okay, I'm ready for some more of those aha moments.
Okay.
Where do we begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan back in 2011. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake triggered this massive tsunami that just devastated coastal community. There was widespread damage, and a lot of people lost their lives.
I remember seeing those images on the news, the giant waves crashing over buildings, the stories of people being swept away. It was just heartbreaking.
It was a tragedy of epic proportion. But what makes this disaster so relevant to our discussion is what happened at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
Ah, yes. Fukushima. That name has become almost synonymous with nuclear disaster. Tsunami flooded the plant and led to meltdowns, radiation leaks, and a huge evacuation zone.
Exactly. Fukushima became a global wake-up call, forced the world to really reevaluate the safety and sustainability of nuclear power, especially in areas that are prone to natural disaster.
What do we learn from Fukushima? Did it change how we think about nuclear energy?
It absolutely did. In the aftermath of Fukushima, there was this global push to enhance safety protocol, improve reactor designs, and reassess those risks associated with nuclear power plants, especially those that are located in seismically active areas.
So in a way, you could say that Fukushima, while tragic, it also led to these innovations and safety improvements in the nuclear industry.
That's a good way to put it. It forced us to confront those potential consequences of complacency, the need for rigorous safety standards, and the importance of transparency and accountability when you're dealing with nuclear energy. Okay, let's move on to another disaster that happened in the 21st century and really captured the world's attention, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. And this one hit close to home, right here in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, I remember the explosion and sinking of that oil rig and the millions of barrels of oil that spilled into the Gulf, all that environmental damage to marine life, the impact on coastal communities and industries like fishing and tourism.
It was a really stark reminder of those risks that come with offshore drilling, the potential consequences of cutting corners on safety, and how interconnected our ecosystems are.
Did we learn anything from Deepwater Horizon? Did it change the way we approach offshore drilling and our environmental regulation?
Definitely started a national conversation about energy policy safety standards and the need for stronger environmental protection. People were calling for increased oversight of the oil industry, stricter regulations, and investing in renewable energy sources.
But did those calls for change actually lead to anything concrete? I mean, we're still drilling for oil offshore, aren't we?
That's a really complex question. There were definitely some reforms that were put in place, things like stricter safety regulation, improved spill response capabilities, and more environmental monitoring. But there's still debate about whether those changes go far enough to prevent future disasters.
So some progress, but also this ongoing challenge of balancing our need for energy with protecting the environment and keeping people safe.
Right, and it really highlights the importance of staying vigilant, staying engaged, and holding those in power accountable to make decisions that protect both people and the planet.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a different kind of disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic. It hit us all really hard, disrupting our lives, our economies, and showing us just how vulnerable our healthcare systems and our interconnected world really are.
COVID-19 has been a defining event of the 21st century, a global crisis that made us confront those vulnerabilities in our healthcare system, the interconnectedness of our world, and the critical importance of public health measures and scientific collaboration.
I remember those first few months of the pandemic, the lockdowns, the fear, the uncertainty, the rush to develop vaccine. It felt like the world had been flipped on its head.
It was a time of massive disruption and change, but it also highlighted the amazing capacity that humans have to innovate, to adapt, and to come together when times are tough.
You're right, the scientists working tirelessly to develop vaccine, the healthcare workers on the front lines, risking their lives to care for the sick communities, finding new and creative ways to support each other. It was inspiring to see.
It really was a testament to human resilience and our ingenuity. And it also highlighted the importance of clear communication, trusting science, and global cooperation when we face a pandemic of that scale. But it also exposed some deep inequalities, didn't it?
Yeah.
The pandemic had a much bigger impact on vulnerable communities, those who didn't have access to good healthcare, those living in poverty. It really underlined the need for systems that are more equitable, more resilient systems that put the health and well-being of everyone first.
So what are the main takeaways from the COVID-19 pandemic? What have we learned that can help us be more prepared for future pandemics?
Well, one of the most important lessons is that we need strong public health systems.
Yeah.
This includes things like having really good surveillance system, being able to detect outbreaks early, and making sure our healthcare systems can handle a surge in patients.
So being prepared to respond quickly and effectively to outbreaks.
Exactly. And we need to invest in research and development for new vaccine, new treatments, new diagnostic tools so that we're not caught off guard like we were with COVID-19.
So it's about prepared, but it's also about recognizing that global health is all interconnected. We need to work together internationally. And we need to address those social and economic inequalities that make some communities more vulnerable than others.
You've got it. And it's about understanding that pandemics, like other disasters, aren't just about the immediate crisis. They're also about those long-term consequences, the economic fallout, the mental health impacts, the shifts that happen in society.
It's true. The world's changed so much since the pandemic started. We see more people working remotely, more awareness of mental health, and a renewed focus on how important community and connection really are.
Those are all really valuable insights. The pandemic has made us rethink our priorities, how we work, how we live, and how we connect with each other. It has shown us how important it is to be resilient, both as individuals and as communities, especially in a world that's becoming more complex and unpredictable all the time.
So we've talked about three major disasters today: the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and the COVID-19 pandemic. What's the common thread that runs through all of these events What's the big takeaway message for our
I
listeners?
think the main takeaway is that disasters are not isolated events. They often happen because of these complex interactions between what we do as human, environmental factor, and the technologies that we create. Disasters expose our weakness, they challenge what we believe to be true, and they force us to change and come up with new solutions. But they also show us how resilient we can be, how compassionate, how incredibly inventive we are.
That's a powerful message. So it's not just about getting through disasters, it's about learning from them, building back in a way that makes us stronger, and creating a world that's more resilient, sustainable, and fair for everyone.
Exact. And that's why it's so important to study the history of disasters. It helps us see the patterns, those connections, the lessons learned, and ultimately it helps us make better decisions so we can create a brighter future.
And for those of you who want to learn even more, we highly recommend checking out Conrad Reicher's book, The Dawn of Disasters. It's available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's a great book full of fascinating stories and insights about the disasters that have shaped our world.
Well, everyone, it brings us to the end of our deep dive into the history of disaster. We hope this journey has sparked your curiosity, broadened your understanding, and maybe even inspired you to take action to create a safer and more resilient world.
Remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future. By learning from the mistakes and the successes of those who came before us, we can face those challenges ahead with more wisdom, with more compassion, and a shared commitment to building a better future for all of us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay resilient. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.